This is the Philosophy of Criticism, Part 1. I want to remind everyone, I might be wrong about the things I'm saying, so pay attention and keep an open mind and an active mind and see if you agree with me or not. In the previous videos, we used evidence to refute theories. So the purpose of the evidence is for refuting theories. It's for criticism. In this video, we're going to talk about other types of criticism besides evidence. So what types of criticism are there? First of all, there's argument. You can give an argument that some idea is a mistake. Evidence is always used in arguments. You can't just have evidence all by itself. You always have to explain what does the evidence have to do with whatever you're discussing. Why is it relevant? Sometimes it's pretty obvious why the evidence is relevant, so people might leave it unsaid, but there always is some sort of argument that uses the evidence. So, all criticism is used in arguments. So, in a way, argument is the only type of criticism. And arguments always include some kind of explanation. They always say what their purpose is. They always say what do the ideas in the argument have to do with the conclusion it's arguing for. They always say, if they're a criticism, what's the problem with the idea they're criticizing? So, just because all criticism is arguments doesn't mean we can't look at different types in somewhat more detail. So all of these are types of arguments, but they're still somewhat different. So I have a list of criticisms here. It's not all the possible types of criticism, it's just a selection of types that I'm going to explain. But there's definitely other types. In this video, we're going to look at the first four, but first we're going to look at some invalid types of criticism. So these are things not to do. I'm not going to talk about them for a really long time because basically they're what not to do, and I don't want to tell you how to be a bad philosopher. But I do want to go over them briefly. They would be especially valuable to you if you thought one of them would be a good argument, because then you can learn something that it's not actually a good argument. So I'm not going to go in full detail, so if you don't understand why one of them is a bad argument, I might not tell you enough about it, but hopefully you could figure it out yourself, or you could email me if you want to. So, saying an idea is true because it's popular, or a lot of people believe it, or everyone knows it's true, that doesn't work. Sometimes everyone knows something's true, but they turn out to be wrong. Similarly, if you say, oh, that can't be right, it's weird, or it feels wrong, or it's unintuitive, or it contradicts common sense, that's a bad criticism, because sometimes ideas do all those things but turn out to be true anyway. Another criticism is to attack the author or his writing style. You shouldn't do that. A good criticism stays on topic, and it deals with just the ideas, not the author. Another bad criticism would be say, well, you didn't prove that. Sometimes people don't have a proof for their idea, but it's still a good idea. What you really should do is look for a problem with the idea. If you can see some sort of flaw in it, that would make a good criticism. But if you don't see any flaws at all, then it not being proven isn't really that important. It's the same thing with authority or justification. If you see a flaw in the idea, point out the flaw. If you can't see any flaws at all, then you have no business criticizing it. Another bad criticism is to say something's obvious. Any type of argument saying stuff is obvious is a bad argument, because sometimes people think stuff is obvious, but then they turn out to be mistaken. Another bad argument is an appeal to fallibility. You say, well, you could be wrong, but you don't actually give any reason they would be wrong. One thing about that argument is you could use it against absolutely anything. All our ideas are fallible, so it would be a criticism of every single idea if it worked, which would be pretty silly. Another bad criticism is if you don't like the conclusion of an argument, that doesn't make it false. Sometimes we don't like the conclusion, but it's true anyway. Alright, let's talk about contradictions. Contradictions are a pretty important idea. Whenever two ideas contradict, at least one of them has to be false. So whenever we find a contradiction, we've got at least one false idea on our hands. So there's definitely something we can learn there. Also keep in mind they might both be false. You shouldn't assume when there's two contradicting ideas that are rival theories, you shouldn't assume that one of them is true. It reasonably often turns out that they were both wrong, at least in some details. So one thing we can do is suppose someone has a big, complicated argument. You know, they write 10 pages and they give this huge argument and they come to a conclusion. If you can find two ideas that they used that contradict, and if they needed both of them, then the whole thing has to be wrong, because at least one part of it that was needed is false. That doesn't necessarily mean the conclusion is false, it just means that argument for it didn't work. However, if you take away the argument for it, then there's no reason to think it's true, unless you have a new argument. Non sequitur is Latin for does not follow. So it means that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. Or in other words, you say something because something else, but they don't really have anything to do with each other. It's just an argument that doesn't work. So in a sense, all arguments are non sequiturs because they have some sort of mistake where you thought something would follow from something else, but it didn't. So for an example, the sky is green, therefore I am tall. You can see that it just doesn't make any sense. So non sequiturs can be kind of hard to criticize because they don't make sense. So when possible, try to give other types of criticism besides just saying it's a non sequitur. But there are ways you can deal with them. Like with the sky is green example, you can say, why do you think that the color of the sky has something to do with your height? You can ask them about the relationship between the things they're talking about. And when they try to answer your question and think about it, maybe they'll see the problem. Alright, complicated is a good type of criticism, because arguments should be clear, they should be understandable. If it's confusing, that means there's room for improvement. So, just because something is unclear doesn't mean it's false, but it does mean it could be better. So any type of criticism that lets us improve our ideas is a good type of criticism. It doesn't necessarily have to refute something outright. A similar type of criticism is saying something is vague or ambiguous. Because just because it's vague doesn't mean it's wrong, but it does mean that the argument should be improved. It should be clarified. Vague arguments especially are a problem because you can't really tell what they're saying, so how do you know if it's true or not? And if you try to criticize it, usually they say that's not really what they meant. So again, they need to clarify it, and then you'll be able to criticize it, then you'll be able to engage with it better. An ambiguous argument is one that could mean two or more things. This is basically the same thing as a vague argument, but usually with an ambiguous argument, there's a small number of possible meanings and you're not sure which one it is. With a vague argument, there's so many blanks to be filled in that it could have 100 different meanings. In the next video, we'll go through the next 4 types of criticism.